Chapter 24 of David Ransom's Watch by Pansy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 24. That short, potential stir that each can make but once. "It was very sudden at the last," said the nurse to Miss Hannah. "Cases of this kind often are. As soon as I came on duty this morning, I saw that there had been a change. But I didn't think, even then, that the end was so near. I thought of you right away, but you hadn't left any word about being sent for. And, anyhow, I knew you would be here likely this morning. If your train had been on time, you would have had a chance to—" She broke off with that, and began again. "He asked once or twice what time it was, and if you had come. And he was growing weak so fast that at last we phoned, and found that the train was late. It seems too bad, doesn't it, when you have been so good to him?" The nurse's manner was very respectful. She knew Miss Stearns well by reputation, and had been duly impressed with the care and attention shown to a stranger who had confessed some weeks before that he couldn't occupy a private room very long for want of means. The college girls went away in haste, wiping tears from their eyes, and drawing their large hats well over their disturbed faces. They were young, and death in any form was a solemn and awesome matter to them. "I am so glad you could do that wonderful thing for him," said the youngest of the three, linking her arm in that of the soloist, and kissing her under cover of the hall before they passed out. "It was beautiful, dear, and it would have killed me to have him die without a prayer when he had asked for it. But I couldn't have done what you did to save my life." Miss Hannah had no tears to shed. She was dignified almost to grimness, and never more businesslike. She conferred with the physician in attendance, and with the representatives of the board of managers, making all necessary arrangements and answering all questions with her usual brevity. There were no friends, so far as she knew, who could be summoned. There had been a brother, but it was not certain that he was living, and she had no clue as to his whereabouts. There had been, she believed, no communication between the brothers for years. Certainly she would try to discover him, and make every effort to get the valise and valuables belonging to the deceased into his hands. In the meantime, however, all proper arrangements must be made, and the bills rendered to her. Mr. Ransom was a family acquaintance of long standing. His wife had at one time been a member of her own family, and she was evidently the only person left to look after details. For the present, the only thing to be done was to lay the body to rest in the Stearns burial place. Later, if there should be occasion, a removal could of course be effected. It was many years since the wife was buried, and Miss Stearns had not the remotest idea where she was laid. "I did not think he was going to die," she said, looking firmly at the doctor. "There are matters about which I should have felt that I ought to have conferred with him if I had had any conception of such a result as this. But I believed as he did that he would get up again." The doctor, who also knew Miss Stearns very well by reputation, felt his color rise a little at the implied rebuke, which was more in her tone than her words, and answered quickly that while, as he had told her on their first interview, he had not felt that there was much prospect of a recovery, still the end had been unexpectedly sudden to them all. They did not presume to be very wise with regard to this matter of death, and always answered questions with becoming caution. Still, if he had not understood that the patient was an old friend of Miss Stearns, he should have asked for some instructions himself. And then the doctor felt that he and Miss Stearns were even. 2 carriages, in addition to the one for the bearers, followed Ben Ransom's body to its resting place. In one, the Stearns family carriage which was used only on state occasions, sat Miss Hannah and her adopted nephew, Harlan Kingsbury, he having been summoned by a letter whose brevity was characteristic. "Dear Harlan, an old acquaintance of mine who died 2 days ago at the hospital is to be buried here today. I want you to come and say a prayer at the grave. You can take the 2:10 train, the one on which they bring the body, and it will not take a great deal of your time. It seems fitting that your first official duty should be for an acquaintance of the family. I shall meet the train." "What is all this, Aunt Hannah?" the young man asked as he seated himself opposite her in the closed carriage in which he had not rode half a dozen times in his life. "An old acquaintance, you said. Have I ever heard of him? Is he an old man? How did you come in touch with him? Your letter, you see, told me nothing." "I found him at the hospital, Harlan. He sent for me, and I went in twice to see him. It is more than a quarter of a century since I knew him, but he married his wife from my house. She was in my employ. He buried her long ago, and there was no one left but me to bury him. Now, don't ask any more questions. You can see for yourself that there is nothing more to tell. I'm going to bury him in our family lot because there is no other place over which I have control, and it is large enough for a dozen more graves." Harlan Kingsbury was used to his aunt, and obeyed her literally and cheerfully. He was a very new minister, having been ordained but a few weeks, and it seemed to him a beautiful coincidence that his first official duty should be at least remotely connected with the family of which he had for so many years made one. "It is just like you, Aunt Hannah," he said, taking her large, work-worn hand in both of his, as the carriage wound among the great avenues and halted before the carefully kept plot whose handsome center marble bore the family name. "I don't know another person who would have done it, but it is a beautiful thing to do." He believed that he understood the situation perfectly. When he called, as he did on the following evening, on the college girl who was the solo singer of the college trio, he told her that he had been down in the country to officiate at his first funeral, and that the interment was in their family burial plot, the dead man having been the husband of a maid who was, years ago, in his aunt's employ, and had been married from their house. The girl wife had died when she was young, and the husband was old and poor. The college girl was deeply interested and sympathetic, and agreed with him that such tokens of remembrance and regard bestowed upon old servants were unusual and royal. Then she opened her lips to tell him of the old man at the hospital who had died so suddenly, with none of his own about him, but she closed them again. He might question, and her part in that death scene was something which was not to be talked about. The other carriage that followed to the grave that day held Miranda and Jonas, dressed in their Sunday best and sitting side by side in solemn state. When they spoke, it was in subdued tones such as people use in the presence of death. "Ain't it a mite queer," murmured Jonas, "to bury him right in with the family this way, when he ain't any relation at all? She must have a lot of old acquaintances." "Well," said Miranda. Then she was still. After a solemn silence she began again in whispers, as if she feared the leaves and the birds that, save for the crunching of their carriage wheels on the gravel, were making the only sounds in the quiet place. "I've never breathed it to a living soul, and I know you won't. But since you are one of the family, as it were, and it must seem kind of strange to you, I'll tell you that the man we are going to lay in the Stearns family burying ground expected, years ago, as much as he expected to die sometime, and I don't know but more, he wasn't the kind of man you would think ever meant to die, to marry Miss Hannah." "Poor soul," said Jonas. He was thinking of Miss Hannah. They buried him with all the circumstance belonging to people of consequence. One who had known Ben Ransom well could almost have fancied his being pleased with the quality of rosewood and satin and silver that contributed to the beauty of his narrow house, as well as with the fact that he was, after all, to lie in the Stearns family burial ground. "Let everything be done properly," Miss Hannah had said to the undertaker, and he had obeyed her. As for the services at the grave, the middle-aged men, staunch admirers of Miss Hannah, who served as bearers, agreed among themselves that it was wonderful what talent that young fellow had. To think that a boy they had known all their lives could make such a prayer as that! Miss Hannah might well be proud of him. Poor Miss Hannah! That was one time in her life of loyal service to Harlan Kingsbury when her thoughts deserted him. While the others listened with reverently lifted hats and bowed heads to his fine rendering of the familiar words, "I am the resurrection and the life. He that believeth in me, though he were dead, yet shall he live," she heard not a word, not even of that beautiful prayer, into which Harlan, being very young, could not help weaving a tribute of respect for the friend who was not withholding even the last resting place of her beloved dead from service in the interest of others. This struck Miranda as so appropriate and touching that she cried, and even Jonas got out a clean white handkerchief and blew a trumpet blast. But to Miss Hannah in that hour was given the bitterness of a time long past. Instead of spring it was autumn, and the brilliant autumn leaves were being swept into glowing heaps by one named Lucy, and a young man was walking beside her, talking gaily, and they stopped together under the great elm tree, and the young man stooped and kissed the girl. Why should Hannah Stearns, spinster, gray-haired and wrinkled, standing at an open grave, lose herself in such a scene as that? One thing she thought, as, the burial service ended, she went back to her carriage, which was, that if by any means it could be discovered where Lucy's dust was laying, it should be brought to lie beside her husband's. To this end, and also, of course, to try to find Dave, Miss Hannah during the 2 following weeks gave herself to the patient going over of notebooks, account books, business letters, and indeed any scrap of paper belonging to Ben Ransom which his valise and the business house by which he had been employed could furnish. And she found no clue to either. She marveled much that a firm with which a man had held fairly satisfactory business relations for 10 years could know so little about him. It was evidently true, as Mr. Ransom had told her, that he had been merely a machine for them that would be worked as long as it turned in the money, and when that failed, be turned out to rust. There were certain fragments of letters that Miss Hannah picked from among the scraps and glanced at here and there for a moment, then held herself from their reading. Ill-spelled, badly written as they were, she knew that they were scraps of letters from a wife to her husband. Letters that had the appearance of happening to fall among a rubbish of waste papers, rather than of having been saved, but Miss Stearns resolved to hold them sacred. There was scarcely a possibility that they had even mentioned Dave, much less given his address. After holding them in irresolute hands for a full half-hour, she went toward the great fireplace and dropped them in. Given the bare possibility that Benjamin Ransom had a daughter on the earth, and that they two might some time or other meet, there was surely no reason why those ill-spelled scrawls from her dead mother's hand, being intended only for her dead father's eyes, should be held to give the daughter pain. She would do, so far as possible, as she would be done by, and she applied the match and watched the poor fragments turn to ashes. She was very quiet about her search after Dave. Assured that there was no one in touch with her present life who could help her, she shrank from the talk that the knowledge of her effort would make. There had been talk enough already. The neighbors could not easily give up the marvel of having the Stearns burial ground invaded by a stranger. Not that they disapproved. The neighborhood almost to a woman had, as the years passed, grown only kindly in their feeling toward Miss Hannah. She was much richer than any of them, but she did not parade her wealth, and she did much good with it. They knew that no case of need was ever brought in vain to her notice. And now that Harlan had grown to be one of whom they could all be proud, they all, unless one must except portions of the Collins family, agreed that in bringing up and educating a real foreign missionary, Miss Hannah had done a good thing, and one that honored the neighborhood as well as the church to which they chiefly belonged. For by this time it had become quite generally known that Harlan Kingsbury meant, at no distant day, to go to Japan. Just what he could do, away out there, with all the money that Miss Hannah would probably leave him, they were not quite sure. Still, it was remembered that mission fields were always needing money, and if Miss Hannah liked to use hers in that way, she certainly had a right. Being in this mind, they all agreed that, while it was an unusual thing, it was like Miss Hannah, and was really very nice indeed to bury the husband of an old servant in the family ground. And they talked enough about it to create Miss Hannah's one regret for having done so. Certainly she would not set them talking afresh. Not even Harlan heard about her search. Why should he? Of course he could not help her, and he was very busy indeed just now about his own affairs. So she inserted at much expense her carefully worded personals in many Western local papers, and Dave, whose old eyes never rested on one of them, wrote regularly to the college girl, who had a charming light on her face one evening when she said, in answer to a question put by Harlan Kingsbury, who was calling on her, "It has been a good day to me from first to last. I passed, you see, in one of my hardest examinations, and then I had such a dear letter from father just this morning that it brightened all the day." End of chapter 24. Chapter 25 of David Ransom's Watch by Pansy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 25. Social Problems. The face of the Reverend Harlan Kingsbury was not in its usual calm. There was a little pucker between the eyes, an inheritance from some perplexed ancestor, that never made itself visible except when a knotty problem was before him. He had been down home, which was the way in which he always referred to Miss Hannah's place in the country, for overnight, and Jonas had just left him at the station to wait for the express that would take him back to town. Truth to tell, he had come to the country the night before with the intention of making a longer stay than this, having planned to give Aunt Hannah an entire weekday and part of another, a luxury which she had not enjoyed for some time. Seminary work was now quite over. His plans for the coming season were arranged, and while he lingered for commencement week and the various reunions and festivities connected with his class in college, he could well afford to indulge his aunt in an extra amount of his company. He had planned carefully to give her as much of his time as possible, sacrificing a little to do so. For instance, there was a certain function set for that afternoon which was chiefly interesting to him because the girl who nearly always dressed in white and was the best singer in college would be a central feature of the occasion. But he confessed, strictly to himself, that she was that to him of all occasions, and he must sacrifice something. It came to pass, however, that at the farm he had fallen in with a problem so bewildering that it had sent him back to town to study out in solitude just what could be done about it. The painful truth is, that for so strong a mind as Harlan Kingsbury undoubtedly possessed, it was a very weak problem indeed. But there are times and occasions, it seems, when even strong minds exhibit weaknesses, and the plain truth shall be spoken. It did not detract from the wrinkles on his troubled forehead to realize that he had brought his problem upon himself. It had been done in the most innocent of ways. He had been helping certain of his friends to send out the invitations for commencement week, and had pleased himself by writing Aunt Hannah's name with many flourishes on one of the great square envelopes. Miss Hannah Stearns. He had smiled to himself to think how well he knew her, how she would affect the most perfect indifference to invitations in general, and that one in particular, yet in her secret soul would be pleased with the attention, and lay the cards away among her treasures. But he had not yet fathomed the depths of Miss Hannah's nature. Behold, she had announced to him but the evening before that she was going to commencement. "I've got my invitation," she said, glancing complacently at the card in her work-basket, "and I've made up my mind to go. I don't suppose you had the least idea that I would when you sent it. But if you didn't, you've got your punishment, you see, for I shall be there. It is a long time since I've been to any public doings, in town or anywhere else for that matter, but I have my reasons for wanting to see this thing through, and I've decided to do it." To say that Harlan Kingsbury was dismayed is to put it mildly. For the moment he was struck dumb, no words of which he could think being equal to the situation. Aunt Hannah at commencement! She had never been 5 miles away from home since he had known her, save on strictly business errands, and to go to a social function of any sort had seemed to him as impossible for her as it would have been for one of the stone pillars at the great gate. As for conceiving of her presence in the great assembly hall among the throngs of well-dressed women who honored the college functions with their presence, he felt that the wildest flights of his imagination had not been equal to it. Aunt Hannah, in her straight, black dress, without gore or train or flounce or pucker beyond what was absolutely necessary; in her strong, wide, calfskin boots, the narrow skirts just reaching to their tops; in her little knot of gray hair, twisted on the back of her head at just the right height to spoil its shape, and thrust through with a hairpin or two; in her round, old-fashioned waist, too low and at the same time too high in the neck to simulate either of the styles in vogue, though all that the young minister knew about it was that it was queer somehow, quite unlike others. There had been discussions before this day with regard to the matter of dress. When Harlan was younger, and with less knowledge of human nature than he believed he now possessed, he had made certain attempts to modernize his aunt's ideas, and had met with failure. "You stick to your books," she had said in tones more grim than were often used for him, "and let my ways alone. I dress you according to your notions and the notions of others. That is because I don't think you've got mind enough to go against the crowd. You are pretty smart, I know, as smart as they make them nowadays, perhaps, but you haven't grit enough for that. I have, and I don't intend to take to any of their fool ways. I've got a kind of dress that suits me, and that I'm used to, and I shall stick to it as long as I live. And when I'm gone where I can't attend to it, see that you do it for me. A plain black alpaca without fuss or furbelows, remember, when I lie in my coffin." Long before this time, Harlan had given up talking about a matter which had never troubled him much. Everybody in her world knew and respected his Aunt Hannah without the slightest regard to what she wore, and she rarely went outside of her world. Still, he was well aware that if she were at any time set down in a modern parlor, surrounded by women dressed in the trains and trimmings of to-day, she would undoubtedly create a sensation. The very collar which she wore on her too low-necked dress, a plain wide, round linen such as middle-aged women wore when she was 20, would be startling to eyes unused. The young minister tried to fancy her in the assembly hall with the strange-shaped bonnet that had been her best as far back as he could remember her, and tried to think whether she would look most conspicuous with or without a bonnet, and groaned in spirit over the thought of either appearance. Yet he had no hope of effecting any changes. If she had been set in her ways, as Miranda had accused her, when he was a boy, she had not grown less so with the added years. Whatever she realized would directly affect the interests of her boy, she was willing to sacrifice for, but he had no hope of being able to make her understand what it would be to him to introduce her to the fashionable world, at least not without hurting her feelings, and he told himself sternly that not for all the hopes and dreams he had connected with this very commencement season, would he make any move or say any word that could hurt her. Putting away, therefore, the hope of effecting any change in her plans, he set himself to discovering whether or not she had modified her own views of late. "Aunt Hannah, what are you going to wear to commencement?" This was the question that he finally asked, having studied over it for half an hour to try to make it sound unstudied. She had sewed steadily for several seconds before she vouchsafed any answer whatever. Then she had spoken in her grimmest tone. "I commonly wear clothes at home, and I presume I shall when I go to town." He could not resist a laugh at his own expense, but he tried again. "So do the women in town, I assure you. Stunning ones. Our commencement week is quite the fashion. The elegantly dressed ladies will be out in full force, with very much decorated costumes and long trains. Aren't you afraid you will feel a bit uncomfortable with a dress as short as you generally wear yours?" "I don't know why I should, I am sure. According to your story, I shall be the only comfortable person there. At least, I shall not have a yard or two of superfluous cloth tagging after me for other people to step on. I shouldn't wonder if I might add to the comfort of some of them by giving them one sensible woman to look at." "And they wear gloves," said her nephew desperately, not because he felt that it would be of any use to discuss the subject, but because, having started it, one must say something, and he did not see his way out. "White gloves are worn in the evening, Aunt Hannah, long-wristed ones." He began to feel a wicked desire to point the contrast between her appearance and that of the fashionable world. There was absolute composure in her response. "Gloves? Well, I always wear white cotton gloves when I'm working in the garden, because they wash easier than colored ones do. And they've got pretty long wrists, too. I made them out of stocking legs. But I never felt any call to wear them to town." The case was hopeless. He told himself gloomily that he had known it from the first. Instead of spending that entire next day in the country as he planned, giving himself generously to his Aunt Hannah's pleasure, he was, as has been said, taking a train back to town in order to think over his problem in solitude, and reach some decision if possible as to his line of action. Which is why he was pacing the platform of the little station, gloomy-faced and with those unbecoming wrinkles on his forehead. When the train finally slowed up for him, he stalked gloomily into a car, dropped himself into the first vacant seat, drew down a shade almost savagely with a feeling that the glow of sunshine did not harmonize with his mood, drew his soft hat well over his eyes, and, fixing himself as if for a nap, gave free rein to his imagination and created a scene for his further discomfort. He put the main reception room of the college in festive array, lighting it brilliantly and arranging with cruel insistence a charming background of color to meet and help set off to advantage the costumes that he presently allowed to come flowing in, as he gathered the very cream of the social world to honor the occasion. Nor did he forget to make the girl graduates conspicuous among the throngs, not alone because of their class colors, but because he well knew that every white-robed maiden among them would be arrayed in a gown befitting the rare occasion. He saw them all as a bewildering whole, but promptly his keen eyes singled out from among the groups one so beautiful, so graceful, so superior in every way to all the others, that every eye must needs be watching her. For himself, he knew, poor fellow, that he should have eyes only for her. Yes, for her and one other. He saw himself bringing forward to be presented to this radiant creature a strong-minded elderly woman in a very short, queer black dress and very thick, strong boots, whom he must acknowledge as my Aunt Hannah. Could he do it? Put away all thoughts of self? Give up all the dim, delicious hopes that he had dared at times to indulge in connection with that vision of grace and beauty, and boldly acknowledge his plebeian origin, his humble connections, thus confessing and emphasizing his utter unfitness for associating with the jewel whose very setting was royal? Following out this train of thought, he jammed his hat still more over his face, and told himself angrily that the painful experience would serve him right for imagining even for a moment that a girl of such exquisite grace, such unusual culture, such manifest environment as must have been hers all her life, could ever think of him with other thoughts than pity for his narrower sphere. While he thought about it, however, he went to the depths of self-humiliation. He allowed himself to be presented to the fair and gracious woman who had the honor of calling that lovely vision daughter. A woman who wore her robes, as indeed her daughter did, like a queen, and who showed in the very poise of her body the superiority of her birth and surroundings. Nay, he even watched her dignified father, a prince among men, looking down with fond fatherly eyes on his royal daughter, and feeling that she did him credit. And then he made himself bring Aunt Hannah to be introduced to these magnificent personages. Aunt Hannah who, he was sure, would not shrink from meeting royalty itself, and would feel herself in every sense its equal. "And she is," groaned this much beset young man. "She is a royal soul. No one believes it more thoroughly than I. I would despise the woman who laughed at her, and knock down the man who dared to sneer, even though he were her father, provided they could meet under reasonable conditions. But in that reception room, with hundreds of fashionable women, some of them merely creatures of fashion, and with hundreds of gay college boys to stare, and comment, and laugh! Oh, even for Aunt Hannah's own sake, how was it to be endured?" Back of every other thought, moaning itself through his inner consciousness like a dismal refrain, was all the time the question: what would she, that one for whom all feminine pronouns were made, think of it all? What could she think, save that he had presumed on her kindness and sought a friendship quite above his own sphere? This thoroughly American young man was sane on all other subjects but the one connected with one rare bit of flesh and blood. He talked no nonsense about spheres and necessary environment, according with the most democratic among them that in this land at least a man's sphere was what he made it, and that environment created no lasting necessities for him. But before one lovely bit of clay, all theories having to do with common sense seemed to have lapsed. She, he told himself, might even believe that he wanted to secure her friendship simply on account of her social position. That he might, through her, climb. The thought was gall and wormwood. "As though I should care," he told himself, with delicious disregard of the slight that his logic cast upon her. "If her father were a day laborer, and her mother a washerwoman, so that she was what she is." Then he tried to put aside visions and gave himself to the business of determining his course of action. Might it not be just possible that after the public exercises of Commencement Day were concluded, he could smuggle Aunt Hannah away? Or would she insist upon honoring that fatal invitation of his to the evening reception? For one despicable moment the young man considered the possibility of failing to meet the train, and allowing Aunt Hannah to lose herself in the bewilderments of the public functions without ever discovering him, or having herself discovered as connected with him. But this, he was glad afterwards to remember, he put away at once with a sneer for the passing thought, and an assurance that nothing should ever tempt him to such meanness. It was just then that he became aware of other occupants of the car, and of a remarkable conversation that was being carried on just in front of him. It had been in progress for some time, but the young man's troubled, preoccupied mind had taken no notice of it until a word, a name indeed, suddenly arrested his attention. End of chapter 25. Chapter 26 of David Ransom's Watch by Pansy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 26. What's in a Name? Occupying the seat just in front of Harlan Kingsbury was a tall, clean-shaven, gray-haired man, dressed in an everyday suit of unmistakably country manufacture. An old-fashioned collar and a necktie belonging in material and make-up to the long ago, as well as every other detail of his dress and appearance, marked the old man as one of the great multitude, the toilers and breadwinners of our country. His seat companion, with whom he was talking eagerly, wore about him that unmistakable something which marks, and must always mark, the true minister of the gospel who has been long in the service, no matter how carefully he may avoid advertising his profession with clerical dress or mannerisms. A half hour before Harlan Kingsbury had boarded the train, the clergyman, grip in hand, had walked leisurely down the length of the fairly well-filled car, scanning the passengers with interested eyes as if in search of a friend, and had finally halted before the old man's seat. Other passengers had already looked a second time at that neat old man, whose faded blue eyes had in them such a kindly light. They had noticed his talk with a little child just across the aisle, and had heard ungrammatical phrases occasionally, and words not pronounced in accordance with the latest authority, but they had noticed also sentiments that came evidently from so clear and pure a soul, and from so kind a heart, that instinctively they had been drawn toward him as a man to be trusted. Perhaps that is what stopped the minister, while the old man made haste to remove his bag and sit closer into the corner, but the words first spoken were, "Unless I am entirely out of my reckoning, this is my old friend and brother, David Ransom." There had been a moment of astonished scrutiny on the part of the old man, followed by a sudden lightening up of his expressive face and a volume of eager words. "Well, if I'm not beat! I believe in my heart that it's him. My eyes! It don't seem possible that it's more than 20 years since I had a look at you. But it is, Pastor, and you're him. I see it plain enough now when you smile. You can't ever hide that smile. Well, well, if I ain't glad to see you. I'll tell mother that paid of itself, without another thing. Where are you going? And where be you, anyhow? Set down, Pastor, set down, and tell me all about it." His tone was so eager, so filled with delight, that the passengers all about him, strangers to him and to each other, looked at one another and smiled in sympathy. The minister made haste to take the offered seat. 20 years was it since Ray Prescott had sat in the neat kitchen of the little wind-swept farm and heard David Ransom tell the story of hope deferred in connection with his father's big silver watch? He went over the headings of the intervening years for David Ransom, and the old man listened and questioned as people do who have long been separated and have heard only vague and general outlines concerning their friends, and for years not even those. David Ransom had loved the young man whom he called his pastor with no common love, and when he said for the third time, "My eyes, ain't it good to see you once more?" all his heart went with the words, and the minister, whose hair was plentifully sprinkled with gray, felt his own heart beat warm and strong for this friend of his youth. "And now, Brother Ransom," he said, when the scattered threads of his own story were gathered and tied, "tell me about yourself. There is one thing I have thought of a great many times and wished I could hear about. Do you remember that very last time I saw you? You were going the next day to buy a watch, a great big ticker like the one your father left for you. Did you get it?" The old man laid his big, toil-roughened hands on his knees and laughed until he shook the seat, and the people about him laughed in sympathy. "I did that," he said. "The prettiest and the finest and the most precious watch that ever this world held, I do believe. I carried it home to mother that very afternoon, and I says to her, 'My eyes, what a steady beat it's got!' And it had. I'll never forget how it felt to have it beating away close to my heart." "And you've kept it all these years?" said the minister in his sympathetic voice. "And it keeps good time? I would really like to see that watch, Brother Ransom. I feel as though I, some way, had a part in its history." One large, worn hand was laid upon his knee for emphasis, as the loud, hearty voice made answer. "So you shall, Pastor, so you shall this very day, if you come with me to where I am going. No, I ain't got it with me. It is a sight too precious for me to carry it around all the while. But I'm going to set my eyes on it this blessed day, and if you will come along, I'll show it to you with all my heart, and if ever you see a watch in all your life equal to it, why, I should like for you to tell me where." The minister was puzzled. "But where do you keep it?" he asked. "Why, brother, this is extraordinary. I have always supposed that watches were intended to carry about with us." David Ransom fairly bent double with laughter. When at last he could speak, he said, "Now I've really got to tell you all about it. I went up to the junction all right that very next morning, just as we had planned, and I had the $17 sewed into my pocket. Mother, she had a feeling that I might be tempted to use it up in some other way, you know. Don't you remember how she charged me not to let anything home or foreign hinder my bringing back that watch? And I promised her she should hear its heart beat that very night. Well, you know we had to wait quite a spell at the junction for the express train, and I see a youngish kind of a woman sitting around there a good while. I didn't notice her much. I guess maybe I didn't see her at all until her baby woke up. She was a little mite of a creature, but she had great big eyes and the loveliest kind of a smile. That smile went right straight to my heart, Pastor. A stone couldn't hardly have helped smiling back. After a spell, the woman asked me to hold the baby while she ran over to the other station, you know, for her bag that she had forgot. And of course I did. And the long and short of it is that she never came back." "What!" exclaimed the minister. "Deserted her child and left it in your hands? That is monstrous." "That's what she did," said David Ransom gravely. "She may have had sorrowful reasons, poor critter. I've never felt called to blame her too much. She was a sickly-looking woman, and there's times when I thought maybe she was taken sick and couldn't get back. It is a great big world, you know, Pastor, and accidents happen that you don't hear about." "That is true. And what did you do with the child? Got her into a home, I suppose?" "Yes, I did that. I got her home just as fast as the next up train would take me, and put her into her mother's arms. And says I, 'There's the watch, mother, sure enough,' and I've watched it every blessed minute this afternoon, and she has beat that little heart of hers regular against mine the whole time, and she's kep' her little fist tight hold of my thumb with a grip that I can't ever get away from. And I never did, Pastor, never." "You kept her," said the minister, "and brought her up? That is an extraordinary story. Then you have 2 daughters? What did Mrs. Ransom say to this one?" "Well, Pastor, at first she didn't say a word. I kind of think that for about 1 minute she was troubled over the other watch. But she took the little thing into her arms and heard its little heart beat, and she cuddled it, as mothers do, you know, and listened to its little story, and after we had got the baby to bed all nice and comfortable, and she had smiled that wonderful smile at hers at mother, and gone to sleep in her arms, she says to me in her gentle, quiet way, you remember mother's way, don't you? 'Father,' says she, 'we are poor, and we have hard work to make the ends come together sometimes, and $17 won't go very far towards keeping a watch like this beating. But after all, if Providence had given us a little girl of our very own, we would have took care of her, wouldn't we? That we would, says I, and I spoke up right quick for me. We wouldn't have heard a word about her going to any home except the one that this baby is in this minute, and we'd have trusted Providence to show us how to make the ends meet, just as he always has done, wouldn't we? And Mother agreed, and so we did it. And Providence did his part too, Pastor. It is a curious thing, and I don't pretend to understand it. I'm content with just knowing it. That there little watch of ours had no sooner got inside the door than it seemed as though things began to look up with us. I never had such crops in my life as came that year. And ever since, Pastor, we've been prospered in about everything we undertook. We haven't ever seen the time when we've been what you may call troubled to get whatever was needed for the child. And the older she grew, the more she needed, of course. Some years I'll own that I felt almost scared the way things went. And it was curious, too, about the missionary money. She was kind of home and foreign both, don't you see? She didn't belong to us at the very first, you know, and then she did. And so Mother and I said it was foreign and home again. Mother and Father both in it. You remember, don't you, how interested Father was in foreign missions, and Mother kind of leaned toward home, and my wife and I had always tried to put them together? Well, we thought we ought to make our gift for them both a little bigger each year, because the child certainly grew into a bigger blessing every year of her life, and we worried ahead a little at first, for fear we couldn't always do it. But we got over that, for we ain't missed a year. Take this year now. We've had extra expenses, you might say, right along. And on the other hand, the child has been the biggest kind of a blessing to us this very year. It was only last month I says to Mother, if I don't know better, I should be afraid that we should have to let up a little on our thank offering this year. And Mother says, there couldn't be a worse year for it. Money is needed more than ever, and we've never in our lives had bigger causes for Thanksgiving. And, Pastor, the very next week there came along a man and paid me a debt that I'd never expected to get, and most forgot, and interest, too. What do you think of that? It is a wonderful story, said the minister, smiling over the fact that the old man's voice had kept growing louder in his excitement until his neighbors on either side were hearing and enjoying. It is a wonderful story, brother. He is a safe one to trust, isn't he? So you have brought up 2 daughters, eh? Is this one with you at home? By the way, what is her name? I haven't got but one daughter, Pastor. Providence never gave us only this one, and she is in college, you know. What? Is my little star scholar the daughter about whom you have been telling me? Why, Brother Ransom, I have always supposed that she was your very own. So she is, said David Ransom firmly. So she is. There never was a father and mother that more truly had a daughter than we have. But we never had but the one. This is extraordinary, said the minister. But now, do you know that I haven't the child's name? If you mentioned it in writing, it has slipped my mind. You had a habit of saying the child, you know, and she in writing to me signed only an initial. I was thinking but this morning before I met you that it is absurd in me not to have learned her full name. Why, Pastor, I've been telling you her name all along. It's Watch, just Watch. That's all the name we give her. She didn't need any other. Seems as though she was Father's present to me all the time, don't you see? Our little Watch. I was hankering for a silver one, you know, and Providence gave me one that was pure gold, and just as much Mother's as mine, which made it a great deal better from the first, you see. Why, this, said the minister, is perfectly astounding me. You don't mean to say that my little college friend never had any other name than that. What an extraordinary idea! Does she like the name? By the way, does she know her own story? Brother Ransom, I'm simply bristling with questions. David Ransom gravely gave himself to their answering. Well, Pastor, at first I kind of think she didn't exactly like the name. She didn't say so, but we had a feeling that she didn't, and it troubled us some. You see, there were 2 or 3 boys in the neighborhood that teased her about it, but after a spell she got to loving it, and said she wouldn't have any other name for anything. Oh, yes, she knows all that we do about her early life. At first we thought we wouldn't tell her, but before we knew it, some of the neighbors had done it for us. Let it out, you know, without really meaning to. And there was a few days when I think she had some unhappy feelings because we were not what she called her truly father and mother. But one day, along with one of her Sunday school cards, she made up the explanation that suited her. The card had this verse on it: "When my father and mother forsake me, then the Lord will take me up." And she came to me with her face very still, and climbed on my knee, and says she, "Father, I've thought it all out. You are the father, and mother is the mother that the Lord picked out for me after he took me up. Isn't that the way it is?" And she kissed me, Pastor, right over both my eyes in a queer, grave little way she had. I guess there was tears in 'em. Her face sounded so kind of sad and sweet that I couldn't keep 'em back. But I told her that I believed that was just exactly the way it was. And then she says, "And you call me Watch so as to let the dear Lord know that you were going to keep watch of me all the time, for him, didn't you? And now I shall like my name forever and ever," says she, in a grave, sweet way she had. And I reckon she has. It appears to me that is pretty good theology, ain't it? Anyhow, it suited us. And we've been happy ever since, Mother and me and our little Watch. It was at the moment when David Ransom first spoke this singular name that the young man in the seat behind him sat erect, pushed his hat back from before his face, and stared with a half-bewildered, wholly annoyed expression at the kindly-faced old man. What in the world was he talking about? End of chapter 26. Chapter 27 of David Ransom's Watch by Pansy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 27. Wasted Sympathy. Watch! Could it be possible that the earth contained more than one young woman who answered to that name? It was a name that at first he had shrunk from and been angry over. As though she were a mere animal, he had told himself in a fume, instead of being the most perfect creation that ever breathed earthly air. Then, by degrees, he had grown into a liking for the name, letting it linger tenderly on his lips when he was quite alone, trying its effect with his voice toned to different cadences. He tried to arrange from it a pet name that should suit his thought of the girl, and failed. So had her college classmates, apparently. Either they disliked or else reverenced her name. They used it sparingly, and with the ready invention of schoolgirls coined a pet name for her, Queen at first, and then Queenie. The young man had been glad. He told himself that the girl's real name was unique, like herself, was set apart, and would not be toyed with. And, having grown jealous of its sound on other lips than his, he rejoiced over that pet name Queen, and felt its appropriateness. Certainly she was their queen. His jealousy grew fierce, grew absurd. He wished with all his soul that the girl's parents had given her another name for common use, and that he might some day arrange it so that that sweet grave name which so exactly fitted her should be for him and him alone. And here, today, was this common farmer, a coarse, illiterate man, using it freely for some woman to whom he claimed to have given it. In his excitement, this seemed to the young man impudence, almost sacrilege. He felt that he would like to horsewhip the stranger. It was then that he sat erect and turned fierce eyes in the direction of the offender, and instantly toned down his adjectives. not coarse, nor common. Illiterate in a sense he might be called, and commonplace as to his clothes, but no one who could lay the slightest claim to a knowledge of human nature, or who had a pure enough heart to be instinctively drawn toward purity, would ever for a moment apply the word coarse to a face like David Ransom's. It was not in human nature to refrain from listening to the conversation now, especially as the two deeply interested talkers seemed to be indifferent as to who heard them. The younger man stormed his old friend with questions, the answers to which set the guilty listener's pulses to throbbing like imprisoned engines. "And so she is actually the watch you have been talking to me about all the time," said the minister, who seemed unable to find words to express his astonishment. "Did you buy the other one?" "No, pastor, I never did. You see, our pure gold watch needed a good deal more care than a common man-made affair could have done. And though, as I told you, we have prospered right along, we have never seen the time when we wanted to spare money for just a silver watch." There was almost contempt in the old man's voice at thought of the contrast. Then he began in another tone. "There's one thing I didn't tell you. She brought along her father's watch, and it was the very image of my father's, as like as two peas in a pod." "Who brought it, Brother Ransom?" "She did, the baby. It was sewed up in her little petticoat, a big old silver watch. It always made us feel kind of tender toward that poor mother. We took it that the father had died, and the poor mother was in straits, and felt that she was going too before long, and made up her mind to give away her baby to the one that Providence would find for her. And she took the watch along for the child to have something of the father's to keep. Of course, we shan't ever know whether that's the right of it, but mother and me think it is." "If you are right," said the minister, "I hope the poor mother has some way of knowing into whose hands her baby fell. Well now, brother, I have some news for you. I'm on my way to see this wonderful watch of yours, the gold one, I mean. You didn't imagine that, did you? I mean, I had started for it before you invited me to go with you." "You had!" said David Ransom, delight in his voice. "Ain't that queer now? I told you I was going, didn't I? This was a great day for me. I was sitting here being so tickled over it all when you came in that I could hardly keep from laughing. I reckon there will be about the surprisedest girl this afternoon that can be found from Maine to California. You see, she ain't expecting of me. I wasn't expecting of myself. Fact is, this is mother's doings, the whole of it. She got it all up of herself to surprise us both, and sent me off. Yes, sir, Watch is going to graduate this very week. You see, it is what they call their commencement week. Queer name, isn't it? I should think they would call it ending, but it seems them scholars turn things upside down and say commencement when they are just getting done. She belongs to the class that has gone through their course, and there isn't one among 'em that has done any better than she did. I've got a letter from the president of the college, don't you think, and he said so himself. And I'm to be there to see her. That's the greatest. She is to be all in white, and she'll look like a lily among 'em. She'll do you credit, pastor. Do you mean that you are going to the meeting?" "I believe I am." The minister drew from his pocket a booklet containing the announcements of commencement week, and called his companion's attention to his own name announced as speaker. "My eyes!" said David Ransom. "There it is, sure enough, and I never saw it. The fact is, pastor, I hadn't eyes for any name but hers. You see, I didn't expect to know any of the others, and never looked at them, and Watch hasn't written us a word." "It was a very late decision," said the minister. "I expected to have to disappoint them, and I had to telegraph them finally at the last moment. So your daughter probably has not known until very lately that I was to be there. It had a great deal to do with my final decision, the hope of meeting her, but little did I think that I was to have the honor of seeing my dear old friend also." Long before this, the guilty listener behind them knew the name of the college about which they were talking, knew it quite as well as he did when he stole a glance at their program for confirmation. This man in front of him was the distinguished preacher that they had had such difficulty in securing. Yesterday he would have felt honored to be a fellow traveler of his, and would have listened eagerly to his words. Today, in the face of the tremendous discoveries he was making, the commencement orator was of smallest consequence. He was sitting behind Watch Ransom's father! What now had become of that wonderful father and mother whom he had so many times pictured that their visions flashed before his mental gaze the instant he thought of them? Could imagination have conjured a greater contrast than the facts presented? Suddenly a great wave of sympathy overwhelmed him. Miss Ransom was to be surprised. She had no idea that her father was coming. From the talk that still flowed on, he gathered that the two men meant to go directly from the train to the college. They both knew of the class function which was set for that afternoon, and from which he had excused himself because it was the only day that he could give to his Aunt Hannah. They would find Miss Ransom in the large reception room, surrounded not only by her classmates, but by distinguished ladies and gentlemen who had accepted invitations for that function. And this old man would crowd his way toward her, and before all that array of culture and fashion call her daughter. Surely that was far worse than his own coming ordeal with Aunt Hannah. Wait, couldn't he help her? If he could reach the rooms first, and get speech with her, and give her a little hint of what was coming, at least she would not be so taken by surprise. Perhaps he could invent a reason for calling her into one of the small rooms to wait there for her friends. The train was already slowing up for the downtown station. He looked eagerly at his watch. It was late, but if those dreadful men would decide to walk, he could take a carriage and head them off. No, they were commenting on the lateness of the hour, and the minister was saying they would drive at once to the college. There was a certain man whom he wanted to see before the reception closed. Well, Harlan Kingsbury knew the most direct route, and just which way to turn when he reached the building. He might be able to accomplish it. At least, it was worth a trial. He made a dash for the platform, and at risk of life and limb swung himself to the ground before the train had stopped. Alas for his hopes! The short cut that he chose was blocked for half a mile. It was in vain for him to fume, and hold his watch in his hand, and promise the driver extra $50. "That's all right, young man," he said in calm sarcasm. "But you see, I can't drive over the heads of this crowd. If I should, there would be a bigger mess than there is now, and you likely wouldn't get there at all." "I might as well not," Harlan muttered, when at last his carriage drew up before the reception hall. For there, just ahead of him, was the old farmer stepping briskly from a carriage, and following a man who evidently knew his way. Harlan Kingsbury was too late. He made all speed to the reception room, not even waiting to brush the dust of travel from his garments. But neither did the other travelers. Just as he caught sight of Miss Ransom, the central figure of a prominent group, she was always a central figure, he saw the face of the old man from his station near one of the entrance doors, and knew that he had seen her also. But the young man pushed his way to the front. Since he could not warn her, at least he would stand as near to her as possible and watch his chance to show that he appreciated her embarrassment and sympathized with her to the utmost. At last she saw him. Was there a sudden gleam of pleasure in those expressive eyes of hers? He did not know. Certainly her greeting was prompt and cordial. "Ah, Mr. Kingsbury! This is an unexpected pleasure. Did I not hear that you had eschewed the pomps and vanities of this occasion in favor of the country?" He was unaccountably confused. He had not remembered that he must make an excuse for being there at all. He stammered a reply to the effect that force of habit long indulged had drawn him unerringly back to college functions. She began to rally him upon this apparently lame excuse, and to ask what he meant to do with such habits for the future. Would he be likely to find college functions where— and then she stopped abruptly, and caught her breath with a little exclamation, and then— the fairest light that he had ever seen, even on her face, transfigured it, and her voice, vibrating with exquisite joy, rose clear and strong. "Oh, father!" And the next moment the old-fashioned farmer had her in his arms, and his tremulous voice was saying gently, in the sudden hush that followed, "Father's little watch." Harlan Kingsbury remained until the reception was over. He was not very social. The young ladies who knew him best, and liked best to talk with him, murmured in strictest confidence their opinion of his worth that afternoon. "Mr. Kingsbury is no better than a post. He has neither eyes nor ears for any one but Queen." It was true. He watched her steadily moving among the crowds, her hand resting lightly on the sleeve of that well-worn, carefully preserved coat, and listened like one fascinated to the voice that said gleefully to a special friend, "Now I will introduce you to the dearest father in the world. No, I will not even accept yours. He may come just next." Suddenly he heard the old man say, "Hold on, darling, I'm forgetting. You don't know who else is here. Oh, yes, you do, but I didn't. You haven't seen him, though. Where is he?" He raised his voice and beckoned with his hand. "Come over here, Pastor. Here's my little watch that I promised to show you." They laughed with him, not at him. Young Kingsbury, watching jealously, ready to be fierce on the slightest provocation, saw that they all, the society ladies and the gayest college boys, were in hearty sympathy with the pure-faced old man who claimed the idol of the class as his daughter. It might have helped, perhaps, when they discovered that the Reverend Dr. Prescott, whose fame they fully realized, was on such evident terms of close friendship, not only with the daughter, but with her quaint old father. But not one of them gave a hint that they needed help of this sort. Not the wildest boy among them apparently cared to make so much as a pun at the expense of the old man. At the close of the afternoon, the young man went to his room to consider the fact that clothes and culture and even education were not all of life, that true nobility could be recognized at least by some people, despite the disguise of poverty and its accompanying limitations. Also, that some rare souls, of whom Watch Ransom was assuredly one, lived on a plane above the possibility of embarrassments and the need of sympathy for such experiences as these. End of chapter 27. Chapter 28 of David Ransom's Watch by Pansy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 28. Foreign and Home. When the next morning's Eastern Express rolled into the downtown station, Harlan Kingsbury was the first person on whom Miss Hannah's eyes rested as she came briskly to the platform, her serviceable bag that had been on duty for 40 years in one hand, and her serviceable cotton umbrella, without which she never went abroad, in the other. The young man possessed himself of both, boldly kissed his aunt in the presence of 3 college girls who were watching him, and escorted her to a carriage through a cordon of college men who were waiting for friends. Throughout that memorable day, his attention to the singular-looking old lady never once faltered. He had secured for her one of the best seats in the great building where the commencement exercises were to be held, and seated himself beside her, ready to give information upon all points that might interest her. So far had he gotten away from the mood of but the day before, that the curious eyes leveled at him and his companion from all parts of the house did not even annoy him. He had never felt more indifferent to public opinion in his life. There was but one person in the world, and what she would think and feel he believed that he knew. When he recurred to his panic of the day before, it brought a sneer of self-contempt upon him, as he asked himself how it was possible that he could have been such a fool. He bent over his aunt in eager fashion to give her items of interest, then looked about him with the air of one who would like to say, "This queer-looking old countrywoman is my Aunt Hannah who brought me up, and I don't care how soon you all understand it." Truth to tell, the young man's heart was dancing for joy over an added bond of sympathy that he felt sure there would be between him and that other one who made his world. He felt it again when, as the graduating procession was filing in, he saw her take advantage of a momentary block in the aisle to step out of line and whisper and smile a greeting to her eager-faced old father who occupied a conspicuous seat. Then his expressive face clouded for a moment. It was over this thought. Need she ever be told what a fool he had almost made of himself? When the orator for the day was announced, Harlan Kingsbury felt his aunt give a little start, and cover an exclamation while she looked at the program which she had heretofore held in her hand without examination. He bent over her. "I forgot to tell you, Aunt Hannah, that the speaker is my old friend Bert Crozier's uncle, the one who educated him. Didn't you tell me once that you used to know him?" Miss Stearns nodded. "It was a long while ago," she said. "But you will like to meet him?" The young man's voice was actually eager. He felt just then as though he would like to introduce Aunt Hannah to all the celebrities in the world. His exalted mood lasted throughout the day, and if Aunt Hannah had expressed a desire to dine with the college president, it is not certain that he would not have tried to gratify her. He seemed to himself to be making an atonement for thoughts. He took his aunt to the most fashionable restaurant in the city, and indulged in all sorts of extravagant dishes for their belated dinner. He gave what was left of the afternoon to driving with her to various points of interest, and, appearing to her at night in all the glory of full dress, made the tour of the reception rooms with her hand resting on his arm, though even to Miss Stearns herself her black alpaca had never seemed so short and scant, or her strong farm boots so stout. He introduced her to everybody, to the president of the college, as well to Judge Hanley, the president of the board of trustees. This, of course, was not so bad as presenting her to some of the ladies, for she had received 2 personal letters from the college president, and she conversed not only with him, but with other members of the faculty with such intelligence that her nephew felt there was no occasion to blush for her brains. He was not prepared, however, for the effect of Miss Ransom upon her. At that lovely creation of white drapery she stared, not simply in admiration of her beauty, but evidently struggling with a bewildering memory. Nothing could have been more winsome than Miss Ransom's manner to her. She was evidently making an earnest effort to put what she must have thought was an embarrassed old woman at her ease. Suddenly Aunt Hannah exclaimed, "Why, you are the girl who prayed!" Rich waves of color rolled over Miss Ransom's face, and Harlan Kingsbury, feeling that his aunt must suddenly have gone insane, began an astonished, "Aunt Hannah," when Miss Ransom spoke. "Oh, are you? Yes, you are the friend who was so kind to that poor man. I remember you now, perfectly. How strange that we should meet again. I am glad. I was interested in that man, and thought I should like to hear more of him. Wasn't it sad that he should die there alone, away from all his friends? He had friends, had he not?" "Not that we have been able to find," said Miss Stearns, still studying the girl's face with a puzzled look on her own that Harlan, who felt left out of this mystery, could not understand. Where had his aunt and Watch Ransom met before? "Oh," the girl said, "doesn't that seem too sad? Did he give no one any clue to his friends? Do you know, Miss Stearns, I am singularly interested in that man? It is one of the hospital patients," she explained in answer to Harlan's look. "I sang for him one day, the day he died, and your aunt was there. Miss Stearns, I do not suppose there could be two people more unlike than that man and my father, and yet there was something about his face that made me think of father. I wonder if you would notice it. Where is my father? Mr. Kingsbury, I want your aunt to meet him." Said Harlan, "Mr. Ransom is over near the middle arch talking with Dr. Prescott, and he, by the way, is an old acquaintance of my aunt. If you will wait here, I will bring them both." But Harlan Kingsbury, although he believed that he knew his Aunt Hannah very well, and was keyed up to a sufficiently exalted frame of mind to endure anything, was not prepared for the eccentricities she was exhibiting that evening. "Wait," she said eagerly, a restraining hand on his arm. "Don't go yet. Don't go at all. I'm not ready. Did you say it was Mr. Ransom? Did you use that name?" "Yes," said the girl, in gentle wonderment. "That is what he called my father. I am Watch Ransom." "And did you, that is, child, your father's name isn't David, is it?" "Why, yes," said Watch Ransom, smiling soothingly on her. "That is my father's name, David Bennett Ransom. Have you known some person by that name?" Said that bewildering Aunt Hannah, "Never mind. I can't explain now, child. I must see your father, though, and ask some questions. But this isn't the place, I suppose. When could I see him? Couldn't he come, and you too, out to the farm tomorrow and visit me?" "Aunt Hannah!" said Harlan Kingsbury, his face ablaze, but she laid her hand again on his arm. "Harlan, be still. You don't know what I am talking about. But I do, and I must find out. If you can't come tomorrow, when can you?" At that moment came a diversion. Dr. Prescott, who had caught sight of the girl in whom he was chiefly interested, in company with the young man whom he had met as his nephew's friend, now laid a cordial hand on Harlan's shoulder as he said, "Good evening again." And before any introductions could be made, Miss Stearns interposed. "How do you do, Ray?" she said, holding out her large ungloved hand. "I should have known you anywhere, but I don't expect you to say the same of me." Dr. Prescott cordially grasped the offered hand, but gazed, evidently puzzled, then a sudden light breaking over his face. "Can it be possible that this is—" "Hannah Stearns," she interrupted hurriedly. "That's my name. I don't wonder in the least that you have forgotten me. It is a long time, and women always change more than men do. Besides, I saw you this morning. We were old friends, Harlan, before you were born, so of course we don't have to wait for introductions. Can't we sit down somewhere? I want to have a talk with you." Whatever it was that had disturbed Miss Hannah, she had recovered her self-possession and was much the least bewildered of the group. Harlan made haste to carry out her suggestion and find seats at least for Dr. Prescott and his aunt. Then he turned to Miss Ransom to make what apology he could for his aunt's strange conduct. "She has been stirred by some experience of long ago," said the girl sympathetically. "Mr. Kingsbury, what must it be to go backward in memory over half a century? I should like to know more about that man at the hospital. Your aunt was very good to him. The nurse told me that his young wife had been employed in your aunt's house, and that because there was no one else to care for him, she opened the family burial place to receive him. That is not like many people, is it? But I understand it, because it is like my father and mother." Then Harlan Kingsbury recalled that funeral scene at which he had officiated, and felt a keen, added interest as he realized that this girl was in some way connected with the experience. What had his Aunt Hannah meant when she said, "You are the girl who prayed"? As for Miss Stearns, she wasted no time. "Do you know that girl's father?" she began abruptly, as soon as the young people had turned away. "She says his name is David. What do you know about him? Did he have a brother that you know of, and was his name Benjamin?" "He had a brother," said Dr. Prescott, "and lost sight of him many years ago. It was before I knew you, Hannah, that I was intimate with David Ransom. Now that you speak of it, I think his brother's name was Benjamin. I am almost certain that he used to talk of Ben." There was a curious quiver of excitement strangely mingled with pain in Miss Stearns's voice as she asked her next question almost tremulously. Did Dave ever get his watch, do you know?" "His watch?" echoed Dr. Prescott, his face betraying the bewilderment he felt. "Yes, his father's watch that was lent to his brother." "Hannah, how do you know all this? There is a very strange story connected with that watch." "No matter how I know just now. Help me if you can. Is this girl his only child? She says her name is Watch Ransom. What did he mean by giving her such a name as that?" "She is David Ransom's adopted child, and she brought with her when she came to him a silver watch sewed into her little garments. He does not know her parentage, nor her history in any way, save that he saw the poor mother for a few minutes, and she went away and left her child with him." "His adopted child," said Miss Stearns in an awe-stricken voice. "Then God let her take her own father up to the very door of the other world in a prayer that was different from any other that I ever heard. This is wonderful. His ways are past finding out." Miss Stearns went home that night by the late train, as she promised Miranda that she would, and her bewildered nephew went with her, having heard Dr. Prescott promise her to come out to the farm by the morning express and bring David Ransom and his daughter. There was nothing that Harlan Kingsbury longed for quite so much as a private interview with his Aunt Hannah, to learn if possible the solution to this series of puzzles. Miss Stearns had been through many strange experiences that day, but she had herself well in hand, and spoke in her usual brisk tones. "I guess it is all right, Harlan. She is by all odds the handsomest one there, and the best dressed, and she looks as though she had the most sense. She knows a man from a puppy, even when he has an aunt that wears old-fashioned short dresses and thick boots. I don't mind your liking her better than anyone else. I think you show your good sense in doing it." "Aunt Hannah," said the young man, his face burning red even under cover of the darkness, "what in the world are you talking about?" "I'm talking about that girl that you like the best of anyone in the world, and that you were afraid to have me see, for fear I should set her against you. Foolish boy! If she hadn't had more brains than that, would you have wanted her for a wife? You wonder how I know so much, I suppose, but I haven't studied your ways for more than 20 years without learning them. I knew it was one of those young women, and I wanted to find out which one, and I did in about 5 minutes. Now you think I've got a very long story to tell, and I have, but I can't tell it tonight. I have been through enough for one day. Besides, some of it might as well be told once for all when we get together tomorrow. Still, I oughtn't to keep you wondering all night, so I'll just put the main points into a dozen words and leave the rest for tomorrow. That man we buried in our lot is David Ransom's brother, whom I used to know when I was young, and he is the father of this girl, Watch Ransom. She didn't know it when she sang and prayed him just as far on his last journey as she could go. And I didn't either, but I've found it out. And naturally, she and David Ransom will like to hear all that I can tell. There is a part to it, Harlan, that doesn't especially belong to the story and needn't be talked about, but I may as well tell you that I expected at one time in my life to be Benjamin Ransom's wife, and perhaps you can understand that I would have some interest in a child of his. Now, don't let us talk about it any more tonight. I'm as near tuckered out as I often get. Tomorrow I'll answer the 1,001 questions that you want to ask, if I can. But just now, all I want to say is that I understand better than I did yesterday what sort of an ordeal I've given you today. And while I'm proud of you clear to the backbone, and glad that I've proved once more the stuff you are made of, still I don't see any call to make things any harder for you than they naturally must be, and I shan't do it again. There, don't talk." There was no chance. Their carriage drew up at the railway station, and the excited and bewildered and distressed and happy young man who had opened his lips to speak, closed them again. But before he helped Aunt Hannah from the carriage, he leaned over and kissed her twice, as a son might kiss his mother. It was on a June day in the following summer that there was a pretty wedding in the white room of the little wind-swept farmhouse. David Ransom's friend, who during all the intervening years he had lovingly called Pastor, traveled 1,000 miles and more for the privilege of performing the ceremony that made Watch Ransom and Harlan Kingsbury husband and wife. Of course Aunt Hannah was there, and she wore on the wedding day a gray silk gown that lay, at least, 3 inches on the floor, and with soft, rare, old laces, family heirlooms, at throat and wrists, and with her white hair slightly waved and done in graceful bands by the bride-elect, and with a spray of white roses with delicate pinky hearts at her breast, placed there by her boy, Harlan, she looked for all the world like some brave, old-fashioned flower that had chosen the autumn for blooming. "I don't feel any call," she said, "to make it harder for the children than need be." One bit of sentiment unexpected and appreciated merrily, especially by Harlan Kingsbury, came to them through Miranda. Aunt Hannah told them the story, and told it well. It was on the evening before she and her nephew started westward that Miranda lingered after she had performed all imaginable kind offices for her mistress, and finally, after several clearings of her throat and beginnings of sentences that ended abruptly and said nothing, she began. "I should like to see Mr. Harlan married, Miss Hannah. You know what he has always been to me." When Miss Hannah opened her lips to reply, Miranda forestalled her. "Yes, I know you gave me the chance, and urged it, and so did Mr. Harlan. I shall not be likely to forget that, ever. But there was reasons why I couldn't do that. But we felt, Josiah and me, as though we would like to celebrate the day some way. It beats all how much Josiah thinks of Mr. Harlan, though he hasn't known him as we have, of course. But he's attached wonderful for a man. And as for you, Miss Hannah, well, I guess you know what store he sets by you. He shows that by the way he does for you. Well, I'm making a long story of it, but the fact is, Josiah and I have planned a little celebration if you don't think the bride and groom will mind. We have planned that at the very identical hour and minute that Dr. Prescott says the words that make Mr. Harlan a married man, we'll get married ourselves, Jonas and me, in the dining room. It won't make any kind of difference in the arrangements, of course. We'll stay right on here and take care of everything the best we can, just as we always have done. But that is the way we would like to celebrate." Never was there a more astonished mistress than Miss Hannah, but never was more cordial consent given to a marriage. Miss Hannah only stipulated that the ceremony should be performed in the great parlor that, so many years before, had been given up to good cheer, and that Miranda and Jonas should have in certain of their old friends to rejoice with them. Nor did she forget to be generous and substantial in her wedding gift. It was Harlan's saying, just after he kissed his bride and his Aunt Hannah, "Now I should like to kiss Mrs. Jonas Perkins," that turned back the current of a few tears and made them all laugh instead. David Ransom, after he had kissed the bride 3 times and brushed the tears from his eyes to laugh over the thought of that other bride, and kissed Mother surreptitiously to get to quiet, natural ground again, beamed on the minister and said, "It ain't often, Pastor, that things get as mixed as they are today. I used to think that it was the bride and groom that got all the presents. But just you look at this." As he spoke, he drew from its pocket a large, old-fashioned silver watch that was ticking loudly. "There it is," he said proudly. "Father's watch. I've got it at last, and it is doubly dear to me now, of course. The old works wore out, Pastor, but my son had brand new ones put in, and he says it is good now for 2 generations, and it is the same old case that Father and Ben both handled. Ain't the ways of Providence wonderful? Our son says it is in exchange for the pure gold watch that we have given him today, to help comfort Mother and me. I don't deny that it is a great comfort to have it, but it is a terrible change from our little gold one after all." The old man's lips quivered despite his brave struggle after a smile, but the minister's cheery voice took up the word. "You don't need comfort, Brother Ransom. It will be a beautiful reminder of all your blessings, and it is grand that you have it. But comfort! Man alive, honors are just heaped upon you. What did you tell me about your father and mother and their deep interest in the 2 divisions of the Lord's work, and see how you have united them in your watch." A rare light broke over the sweet old face, and his voice rose jubilant. "That's so, Pastor, that's so, as sure as the world. I never see it in just that light before. Our little watch is home, that's certain. She's the very heart and soul of home to Mother and me. And now he is going to take her to the foreign field for a while, so Father can have his share. That's beautiful. And by there won't be any more foreign, will there, because they'll be gathered in. Won't that be a reunion worth having, when we all get home together, and the things that have puzzled and troubled us here are set right and made plain? And then to think that we shall go out no more forever. Thank you, Pastor, thank you." End of chapter 28. End of David Ransom's Watch by Pansy. Recording by TriciaG in May and June of 2020. Thanks for listening.